I started thinking about nursing in secondary school. So when doing my GCSEs, I decided to do health and social care and history. But health and social care is where I learned a bit more about, healthcare, biology, um, social care, uh, just looking at how you're looking at the laws and influence behind healthcare. From that, I was able to successfully pass, get double Bs, and also focusing on science. So I did double science, and then got into college, did BTEC National Health Studies, and this was equivalent of three A levels. So from there, I was able to do a whole range of topics from microbiology to chemistry, all very important to nursing. Um, and this is where I studied at Kingston College. And some of the lecturers at Kingston College also studied at Kingston University. Whilst I was doing this course, I was able to do vocational placements, so sometimes in a nursery, sometimes in care homes, just seeing how nurses work in different, areas and aspects. From there, I was able to apply to Kingston University, where back in 2006, I applied to do children's nursing. So that was diploma, so that's sort of being phased out now by the government. So I studied at Kingston University for 3 years and was able to successfully graduate first in my family to become the children's nurse. Whilst at training as a student nurse, I found I wasn't very acutely aware of that there will be racism because you experience it in education, you experience it in school, you're acutely aware of it, but you were fooled to think that maybe there wasn't any sort of racism in nursing, but that became very apparent when I moved to work at Inner London Trust. You always found that white middle class parents sometimes recoil. They don't want you to touch their child, or um, they will phrase a sentence in a way of, oh, I want another nurse. Now, sort of that language when you go back 20, 30 years ago was, don't put your black hands on my child or my relative. But people are acutely aware of having to phrase languages in a way that they're not accused of racism. And when you sort of highlight the racism, they tend to sort of backtrack and be more shocked that you've accused them of racism, naturally looking at the facts. When you analyze it and when you look at it deeper, there's a context that history does keep repeating itself. And I will never forget an instance when me and another black nurse who was of Zimbabwe descent, and her accent is, quite of that local region. And we had an influx of patients that we were triaging because I work in emergency department. So you need to be able to see and get an assessment and observations on them within 15 minutes. That doesn't always happen, but you try to be as quick as possible. And on that day, my manager was on. This woman came in and she was like, how long do I have to wait? Very rudely, very aggressively, to the point where the whole waiting room kind of stared and looked. As a black woman, you have to kind of think, I've got a whole audience watching me. You got to be professional. This is what the NMC Code of Conduct always emphasize. We stopped, we both looked at each other because we both knew exactly what we were thinking. And I turned to her and I said, I'm really sorry, we will get you as fast as possible. She just kind of rolled her eyes, sat down, but her child was fine. He was playing, he didn't even kind of pay attention to it. But what was it about me and this other nurse than the colour of our skin? Because everyone else in the department was kind of just, well, we've all just booked in, we've all told them to sit down. Anyone that looks acutely unwell, you will get to them first, but otherwise, they all walk in, they sit down, they look fine, you will get to them as soon as possible. Now, I didn't feel comfortable seeing this person, so I went to the manager and I said, look, she's not happy, and number two, she was quite rude and she didn't care, so I think you need to see this patient, triage them. Me and this other lady are not going to do it. My manager accepted it because she'd seen this instance, and even she acknowledged to the point that sometimes they can be quite racist. Now, this manager is of white New Zealand descent, and the fact that she acknowledged it was something that I found very difficult because you wouldn't really talk about this, especially with a manager. And when she'd said this, there was a doctor of Indian descent in the room who was typing the notes. She stopped and looked at me, and this is the point where you have that look because you're both not white. You both know that you've experienced it, but you just don't talk about it very openly, especially in a circumstance like this. But the fact that the manager acknowledged it tells me she's seen it before, whether it was with me or other colleagues. And this is where I thought, you know what, it was very frustrating. I remember going home and just really thinking about this and then talking about it with my mother. And she said, yeah, that's just how they are. And I thought, what do you mean just how they are? She came from Nigeria to the UK in the 80s, and that was during the time that Margaret Thatcher was in power. And I can't begin to imagine what it would have been like for her. But she acknowledged it and she said that's just how they are. You just need to just keep working, keep your head down. I felt that my manager should have acknowledged what I was said to her and gone to that one, to that mother and explained, you should not talk to a colleague like that, but we'll still see the child. But I know she didn't, she called the mother in, assessed her child. The child was seen by a doctor and discharged home. But her rudeness, her aggressiveness, that wasn't addressed. And it's something that you get used to. You just kind of sweep it away. You kind of analyze it. You talk about it with people who have the same skin color as you because you all know that feeling. But what can you do to raise it? Because is your union body going to understand it? And something like the RCN that is governed by many white people, would they understand it? You don't. I don't think that would be possible. So you just kind of bury it, and along with a lot of incidents, you make note of it and you carry on. We know that within health and social care, specifically NHS, racism is rampant, and this is just one example where this incident was seen as Mo, no, she's just a bit upset. But when if I was to utter the words racism, I'm pretty sure I'd have been shut down. But the fact that my manager acknowledged this, it showed that she's seen incidences like this before, and I was too afraid to ask her what she'd done about it because actually at the end of the day she can't really then discuss those investigations with you because that's something that's confidential. But she knows that racism is happening, and what is she doing about it? I don't think she's doing anything about it. They are excused, made to feel like, oh, we're sorry, the customer is always right, apologize, and then they get seen and treated. And me and this other lady, we know that she will be discharged home without a thought in the world about how she made you feel in that incident, and she will carry on, and she will do that again to someone else. And you just have to wonder what is, is anyone actually going to challenge her actions and her behaviour? Because I know full well if that was a white nurse, she would not have spoken to us like that because we were the only two visible nurses right there on that day, really working hard. Our manager was behind closed doors, sorting out one, but she could see through the window, and I had another colleague making IV medication, so just us two. And it just becomes a thing where it's racism, and you just you bury it down because that's what sometimes some people do before you, and especially when you're a junior nurse. And at that time, I'd only been qualified maybe 2, 3 years, so I don't have the confidence that I do now. This would be sort of upper management who tend to be like 95% white. We know this from the res data. And when they see racist incidents, what they expect to see is, language such as NIGGER. When you say such certain words like, I want someone else, that's not perceived because they think, oh, maybe she's just having a bad day. And something like what Chimamanda has said is when someone's been foul in a foul mood with you, are they having a bad day? Is it just them? Or sometimes as a black person, you have to ask, is it because of the colour of your skin? Time and time again, when I get told they want someone else, I will leave the room. And it's always an experiment. I will send in a right nurse who may not be as experienced as me. Now, when that family starts to challenge the nurse about the care, because you have to have a skill and a way to answer them, you'll find out, oh, she doesn't know what she's talking about. They want you back. But then why did you send me out the room in the first place? Sometimes just being a black person in the presence of a white person, and you can't explain that to management, they will never understand that. So when it comes to racism, they know that it's happening, but it's almost like you have to be shut down because they didn't see, these words like the N word or the P word said, because that's what they perceive what racism, but actually that's just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more. So what you will find is that there is clearly racial bias in hiring process. When people want to progress within their career for like continuing professional development. So as the NMC says, you have to keep renewing your skills and training. And one of those is that yes, you get your first qualification within nursing, but when you work in a specialist area, so like I work in children's emergency, you have to do sort of emergency course, life support training, things like that. What you'll find is with your white counterparts, they will get these courses more easily. And this was within my first job in emergency care. You'll always find that it will be white colleagues that will get these courses and their training, and they'll be pushed and promoted ahead. And whenever you ask for it, is, oh, you need more experience, or those get ignored. So what I've found easily is just to move from trust to trust. And when you then get to a certain trust, you start to see the power structures in play. And when you see maybe only one or two black people in senior positions, and you're in an area such as Lambeth, which that doesn't really reflect the diversity within that local population, you then have to wonder, what happened to, the Asian people, what happened to the black people, what happened to the people who don't identify as white, where are they? But when I look in this workplace, all you see is like at least 90% are white, and the rest of them, a few, are black. And you have to wonder what happened to the people, where are they? And that clearly tells you that people just leave because they think, well, you know what, I don't have to sit here in a lower position. I know I can get more, hand in your notice, and go somewhere else where you'll be appreciated. In terms of my personal question, so I've been now qualified since 2009. So when I worked for my first A&E job and I moved around, I often found if I wasn't going to get some continuing professional development, because you do have to do revalidation every 3 years, and you need to be able to show to the NMC that you've done some training in university, some clinical, you need to, and it's very important. You want to be able to sit in front of your patients, and these patients deserve to know that actually this nurse has done continuing development. And what I've often found is if I don't get it, I move on. So when I was at one trust, I'd been working there for, I only did a year and I handed my notice in. But in the time that I moved in there, I found out often was not allocated patients for learning and development. You was just constantly just getting bottle feeding and changing nappies when in the previous job you were literally attending cardiac arrest, you were instructing, you were helping the doctors, you were pushing medications, you were on the chest of patients trying to save their life. That takes a lot of skill and dedication. And then I go to a trust where they're like, you just look after this one. So at the time, I thought, I raised this, you get shut down. And then you look at other colleagues, and they haven't been qualified as long as you, and they're white, and they're getting all the extra patients, they're getting all the extra learning and the input, but you, as a black person, are not getting that. And you have to obviously think, what's the difference between me and them? And the one thing that you can often say is the colour of your skin. You try to tone yourself down, you try to make yourself more approachable, smiley, you try to, get some learning, but that's not good enough because you feel as a black person you're invading their space. So in this particular trust, the intimidation that they put in you to write statements when people complain, you have to be very good at writing statements. You have to make sure you stick to the facts, that it gets buried. But then you realise actually, because you've had to write that, your career's not going to go anywhere. So you hand your notice in and move. I've luckily now found a trust that is willing to invest in me, and I've been able to go back to university, get a postgraduate diploma, and use that to keep teaching training other people under my care, and I find joy in it. But it's taken me a long time to get there. I should not have to move from trust to trust. And I can tell you from my previous experience when I applied for a senior position, I know there was a racial bias. So in this instance, I applied for a senior position. I'd done doing a leadership program. I'd had input from heads of nursing, managers, all these people to really train me. And I was part of the Nightingale leadership program, and they teach you and they coach you how you need to really think about these things. And then when you go for the interview, you start to realize that these are the answers that link into leadership. I did all very well. I think I did very well in the interview, and they said they'll get back to you. They got back to me and said I wasn't successful, so fine. They said contact me and they will arrange for feedback. So I emailed, nothing after a week. Emailed again, still nothing. So then I contacted HR and I thought, well, you know what? Forget this. I'm going to go straight to the boss. So I emailed the chief executive and the chief nurse and told them my experience, and I wrote everything down and said, during the height of Black Lives Matter at the death of George Floyd, you said you pride yourself in equality and diversity. However, as a black woman, I felt this is being really shut out on me. The chief nurse got back to me at the end of the day and deeply apologised and said she will try and sort this. By the next day, the lead nurse who interviewed me, who ignored all my emails, oh, I'm so sorry. Let's arrange for a follow-up. But she never explained why. She never did. I went ahead. We did a Microsoft Teams call. So, you can have a video camera, and this video camera for her was completely turned off, all voice. So she might as well just done a phone call conversation with me. But I was smart enough to record the entire conversation, and then I left it as that. I was too afraid to approach the chief nurse, but then I approached her, and I said to her, she never explained why, and she never really went into information. She turned off her camera. It was all voice. She was reading through it, and she kept saying it was a very good interview. It was a very strong one, but you just need a bit more leadership experience. So at the moment, they're looking into this, and I'm meeting with them to find out, because I think there's a bias here. She has clearly given feedback to other people, and then when you look at the nursing team within that aspect, there are a few that maybe are Asian, but within the team, black, you don't see it. So what is it about this place? She's the lead nurse, so she's actively participating in some of her own bias, unfortunately, which is racial bias. Now, when I applied for another position in another city, because I thought maybe I might leave London, they said the same thing. You just need a little bit more experience. And then they tried to say maybe we can get you to do bank shifts. I'm sorry, bank shifts, because if they don't like you, that means you're just, they could cancel you and then you've got no income. And how long is it when people keep repeating you just need a bit more experience? When are you actually going to confront it could be your racial bias? People within my class are in management positions, lead nurse roles. I still am technically in band 6 role, when I should be sort of now between band 7 and band 8. I should be upper, but at the moment I'm still in band 7. So it is affected my development quite a lot, to the point that, a manager joined the trust and she was like, Esther, you've got all this extra training. Why are you working at this level? Now, the previous manager said, there was no money, but her body language. So, I have moderate hearing loss. So you look at people's faces, you look at, as a person with moderate hearing loss, especially people who are hard of hearing, they can pick up a lot from facial expressions and body language. You just tend to. And the fact that when she said this to me, I looked and I thought, she's really lying through her teeth. So I went to a Filipino nurse and I said, this is what she said to me. I've put myself through all this training, trained by consultants, assessed by, lecturers in university, for her to tell me that they won't be getting my position. She took one look at me and said, you need to take this to the head of nursing. So I went to her and I explained this, and there was almost a flash of anger in her face, but she composed herself. She's a black lady, but you could almost see it on her face. And then she was like, no, tell me the training that you've done. So I told you all the modules I've done at level 7. I've done non-medical prescribing. I've done all of this, to be told no. And she said, no, this is not right. We will sort this out. So I met with the matron and the lead nurse for advanced clinical practice. They explained this is what they were doing. But you can clearly tell the matron had been getting her words and her feedback from this manager. And this manager has systemic, I can never say the word systemically, just pulled me down to a level to the point where I led into depression and I was off work for a good 5 months just at the start of the first COVID pandemic wave. And what I've found is that sometimes they seem to be afraid of you when you may be too good. And I don't say that I'm too good. I just felt like I was very much. I've been trained at inner London hospitals that had really pushed their nurses, to be academically thinking, to be challenging. So I've been at trusts where you get that instilled into you. So you come to a trust where they're not actually catching up with other paediatric units in London. So you try to push this, and you're not the only one trying to push the standards of, like to Care Quality Commission to excellent. You don't want to be rated bad. You want to be rated very good. And the only way you're going to do that is you push the standards within nurse training, nurse education, with your managers, with practice development, chief nurse. They all rely on you to push. And she would constantly find ways to push you down, pull you down, and in a way that she'll use the system for her own benefit, but at the cost of me. I don't think it's as bad as what black people experience, but when I look at the experience like Fernando, who's the lead for Filipino Nurse Network, he has been advertising stories that people have come to him, and you almost start to see a pattern for what you experience. And at the height of Black Lives Matter movement, these stories are coming forward. You get Filipinos coming to me; they will be saying the same thing that you almost hear from other people. So Filipino nurses are brilliantly educated. You just have to look at the education they get abroad. It's fantastic. And when they come to work in the UK, you can actually see it. And they do face some obstruction in their development. I don't know if it would be as bad as it would be with someone who's of black descent, but they do. They do. So I was feeling really low, couldn't read, couldn't concentrate. The act of just getting into a shower was a difficult task. Um, the act of just mustering the ability to say hello and work was difficult. Concentration was very hard. It took so much more energy. And on my days off, I wouldn't get out of bed. I would switch my phone off. I wouldn't watch TV. I would just stare into a bliss. And it sort of crept up on me. I knew that this is something that I was experiencing, but you bury it. At work, I could see myself becoming sort of an unapproachable person, a bit angry, hot-headed, serious all the time, challenging people in ways that maybe I shouldn't have. And it got to a point where it was really bad, where I was on at work and I was the only experienced nurse on shift in charge, with pretty much everyone else that was working with me had only been qualified in the last 18 months. That is very, very difficult because having someone who's just a bit more experienced with you on a shift makes all the difference, because you could be looking after someone who's very sick, and if there's another very sick patient, that other experienced nurse would just get on with it. So you can kind of just, are you all right, check in on them, work with them. But when you're the only one, it is very, very difficult. And I was then in triage and I had a mother come up to me and she accused me of breaching and she just kept launching herself at me. Now, all the junior nurses, they didn't know how to defend me because they don't have that experience. Now, if I'm on a clinical placement, if I see someone challenging another of us aggressively, I'd have to step in and say, stop it, please tone your voice down. You've got patients in the department. I have no problem doing that because I have the experience to do that. They may get very angry. I'll call security to de-escalate the situation. They don't have that experience and they all watched me just get ripped apart by this mother to the point that her doctor was like, you need to stop. this is a department with children in the department, be quiet. She still kept going for me. So a doctor pulled her aside and said, you really need to stop. Here's the complaint leaflet for PALS. You need to escalate it to PALS if you're not happy with the care. We will get to the bottom of it. Like Esther said, her manager will investigate it. They will get back to you. They will look at the whole situation. She still was not happy, but she kept launching herself at me. When this was happening, I had a very senior nurse just watch the whole situation unfold. She'd been qualified way longer than me, and she was in a place to say to the mother, stop it and call security. She didn't. And this is where you start to think, people seem to think black women are, strong and this and that, and they desensitize the situation. And this is where things start to unfold, because within the 4 weeks of that situation, it got bad. Then the complaint was submitted to me, well, to my managers. They saw this. They came to me and said, we need to write a statement, which is absolutely appropriate. You have to investigate and look at this. And I said to her, this is what she did. And they said, did you put in an incident form? And I said, what's the point? She said, no, you need to put an incident form because this gets logged. Abuse to staff is not appropriate. When I saw that, her words were just like a thorn, a knife, because it just made me feel even more worse. So I wrote this statement and I couldn't go to work. I couldn't go to study. I was in the middle of finishing the last module for my advanced practice course. So this is where it just completely unfolded. I called work. I said I can't come in. I emailed my lecturer saying I can't come in. My friend called me and was like, Esther, you need to get yourself to the GP. Get yourself to the GP. You cannot function. You need time off work. You've been working in the NHS longer than 10 years. You will get sick pay. You need to go to the GP. So first thing in the morning, I get up, I shower, and I go straight to the GP and I queue up outside. It's cold, it's dark, but I wait. And I got an emergency appointment and I got to see the GP within 10 minutes of arrival. Now, when I sat in front of this GP, her body language, everything, she just kind of was like, oh, you need to go to the Samaritans, or maybe you need to go to A&E. It was just my vulnerable being violated her presence, and she really did not want to be in that room in a chair. And this is where I felt shut down, because had this been me about 3 years before, I would have been really angry, like I demand another doctor. But then I thought, if I get this angry trope, is it going to be now I'm the angry black woman, let's call security and toss her out? 'Cause that's what I was thinking in my head. She just gave me a sick note for 2 weeks and sent me out the door. I went home and my friend called me and was like, Esther, what the hell? You need to go back. And I said, I'm not going back. I said, no, Esther, 2 weeks is not enough. And at this point, I was feeling very suicidal. I'd watched a man jump in front of a train and I thought maybe I should do that, just end the pain. So I called the GP the next day and I spoke to a senior lady and I said I wasn't really happy with the consultation. And she said, do you want medication or... And I said, I just want someone to listen to me because I don't feel like I was listened and I can't go back to this lady. She said, no problem. She cancelled it. And I said, I want this doctor. And this doctor I met a few years before. He was a black guy, but on top of that, he was just very kind. He was very friendly. He was he just listened to you. And he just had all that warmth. And I thought, I need someone who can just see me as a human being. I went back and I literally just fell apart again. And I thought, this is my last chance. Now, if he doesn't help me, I don't think I'd be breathing right now. He started me on medication and he called me weekly, checked in on me, and I saw him face to face. And then obviously with the COVID pandemic, we couldn't see each other face to face. So he was doing phone call conversations. And I managed to get into therapy, CBT, to just get better. And then this is the point where I started to reflect, but sharing with people about, your mental state at that point was very difficult because we know, especially as a healthcare professional, you are at higher risk of mental health. At this time, I was reading a story about Leona Goddard. She was a lady who killed herself, a black lady, I think in Manchester. And you often have to think, what happened to her? Was it happening to me? And then you look at Meghan Markle in an interview, really holding it together. And this was before she did her Oprah Winfrey one, but before that. And she said it's very hard because what she was experiencing was racism. Clearly racism. People say, oh, no, it's not. And I said, it is because she's a mixed woman. And this didn't happen to her sister-in-law, but it happened to her. And, you just become desensitized to it. Eventually I was able to openly talk about it because mental health and black people is a very, very big topic that the government fails beyond. And I knew maybe just talking about my experience, people will actually see, there is human, we are human. And in that point, I logged a complaint against the GP at end of January because I was not happy. It just kept playing in my head. Because I thought, what if there was another lady who is not as strong, who may not be as vocal as I am, who may not know how to work the system to make complaints. So I logged in a complaint end of January. I got a response within 2 days to say they will get back to me. 6 months later, still nothing. So I emailed again in October, November, and I said, what's happening? I logged the complaint. Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't realize. The managed service manager emailed me, and then she spoke to me, and she was overly defensive of this doctor. And I said, but you weren't in the room, and I'm watching this woman's face, especially her body language. Everything was just like, you're violating my space with your emotions. I don't want to hear it. And I said to her, this is not acceptable. Um, she was still sending emails like, we apologize, da 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 da. And I said, this is not good enough. So I went to the ombudsman and I explained, and they said, right, you need to write to say you need a final response to escalate this. So I went and sent one back, and she was like, well, I'm feeling unwell. I will get back to you, whatever. And I was like, okay, yep, yep. And then eventually she got back to me, and then they sent me a letter of apology. Um, but I don't feel what was clearly acknowledged was a black woman went to her at the lowest point and she was sent out the door, and they said, oh, we don't discuss options. And I said, the option you gave me was to go to A&E. We know that when people commit suicide they end up in A&E under section 136, maybe in A&E for 2 to 3 days before they get a secure bed, or even to the point where if you're trying to kill yourself you might end up in a resuscitation bed, and they will do everything they can to try and help you. And we've seen some cases where that is not successful, where the person dies. And I said, I don't want to end up in A&E. I'm trying my best to hold it together and get help. I keep fighting against this racist structure because there were black people before me who really fought. You look at the Windrush generation, the trauma of the fact that they came to this country, faced overt racism, took the jobs on that people didn't. Their children are being tossed out of this country by this government. And you look at a lot of the movement with the rights for black people, freedom wasn't really handed to us. For the fact that I'm in the NHS working in the position that I am, some 60 years ago that would not have been possible. Yeah, you would have been working, but you wouldn't be in a senior position. You wouldn't be given the option to maybe train. And this is when you look at someone like Elizabeth, the very first sickle cell nurse. If she didn't do it, who would have been launching the care for sickle cell patients across the country? Because it is prevalent, and they mostly are black people. And we had black people before she came to the but those people, patients didn't get it. She had to go to America. She had to get all this training from places to really launch it. So if I don't do it, what about my patients? Because my patients could be my sister, my mother, my brother. So you have to keep fighting against it. You have to be their advocate, because who will do it for you? And what you find is that when you feel like you've lost hope, you will always find somebody of colour, even a black person, who will be willing to fight. And you look and you think, you know what, I can't give up. I've got to keep going. Um, Even throughout my training days as a student nurse, when I struggled with maths, I had people teach me. They took time to sit down and teach me. These were lecturers who were black ladies who brought me in. They looked at my essay, challenged me, like, you need to change this. Even after night shifts, they would come and meet me in the library to teach me how to improve my math skills. When I look at throughout my career to get where I am today, it's always been women of colour and black women who have got me where I am, because actually they struggled and people before them helped. I wouldn't know it, but when I look back from the days that I was 18, 19, 20, there were black women always there pushing me, going forward. And I didn't realise, I didn't really pay attention to it, because you're young, you think, oh, there's no racism. Then you start to work in it and you start to see your colleagues who will say certain things. The NHS is very, very vocal about rights for LGBTQ. If you're homophobic in any way, your job's over. But that same sort of energy is not applied when it comes to racism. And, we're seeing this happening with Islamophobia and anti Semitism. It's disgusting. And people will rise up and say all such words about it, but they're not willing to do the same when it comes to racism. So you have to keep pushing. The thing that they say racism is acceptable because they don't understand what racism is. They benefit from it, they work within it, but they're not willing to challenge themselves to what racism is. And it's always that classic picture of the tip of the iceberg. It's not the words, it's systemically denying people the jobs, the pay, the career progression. All of this is racism because now when we look at it, just in last week, a hiring process, a black Nigerian lady sends in her CV for a job, and she looks at it and she wants to know more information about it. She forwards her CV and accidentally gets CC'd in saying again, but Nigerian. Now you can imagine what's been said behind closed doors. If they even see your name that's Nigerian, they toss it out. But why? Because she's Nigerian. Now, if she had a name like Smith, she would have been brought forward. They would have paid attention to her CV. But as soon as they see it's a black person, I'm not racist. My best friend's black. That doesn't exclude the act of racism itself. What people are not willing to understand is what racism really is. It is a huge, huge complex. And as a black person, you'll see in education, in healthcare, in policing. We see it day in, day out, going into the shops, banking, getting a mortgage. People's homes are sold less because they're black, whereas if they put their white friends to do it for them, there's more money. Generation wealth, there isn't much when it comes to black people. The richest people in the world, not one of them is black. They're all white. And this is structures that just keeps building and building. And this is something like even David Olusoga has looked at when you look at Britain's forgotten slave owners. You're looking at people like Benedict Cumberbatch, whose family descended from owning wealth from slaves. So this is all racism, and you can't tell me it's not. Whiteness is always given the benefit of a doubt, and blackness is not. And when you look at my complaint, the doctor was constantly defended and supported by the service manager. She was given the benefit of a doubt. They didn't really acknowledge the words when I said I thought this was racist. The fact that I sat in front of her crying, falling apart, asking for help, and well, there's nothing I can do about it. You need to go to A&E, Samaritans, and get therapy. That's it. I was like, had she said to me, maybe I need to think about offering you medication and you definitely need a few more months off work, I wouldn't have launched a complaint. But she didn't see me in that vulnerable state. What I'm guessing, she probably saw me as a strong black woman who's just had a bit of a bad day. But I went and told her the abuse that I was getting at work, the bullying, the unsupportive manager, the statements, the fact that I've witnessed children dying and I had to bury it, and you carry on because you're in charge. You don't know if there's another case coming in, so you bury it, and all of this just bowled over, and I just couldn't cope. I couldn't even read. If you asked me to pick up a book at that time, I couldn't read. And I thought, how would that be even safe for me to go to work? Because it takes a lot. You're looking at drug calculations. You have to make clear documentation because it's a legal requirement. I couldn't work at that function at that level. And that's where I knew I needed to be away from work. I needed to get better. I needed to be safe for my patients. The one thing that affects me the most is all of it. Because you look at a situation and you can almost instantly link it back to your own life, and reflect on the people. So when we look at the murder of George Floyd, people talked about it. I couldn't watch the video because I'm looking at a man who probably reminds me of my brother. And if you see something like that, you would fall apart. When people were like, oh my God, and I said, tell me how that's different to when Rodney King was getting beaten. Now, I've been in a case where I was at work one day and we had a black teenage boy with mental health problems. He was at his lowest. He came in, he was calm, he was quiet, he was on his phone, he was with his support worker. And I thought, well, I didn't really think anything of it because I was busy dealing with other patients and I had my nursing colleagues deal with that. They didn't even go as so much to go and talk to him or give him the benefit of a doubt. They took the mattress off the bed, emptied the room completely, and put the mattress on the floor as if he's on a prison cell. This boy obviously got upset. What's this? And he's with two policemen. The policemen don't see a boy. What they see is a man who needs to be held down aggressively. But he's a teenage boy. He's just suffering. And we owe him the benefit of the doubt to give him the care. And they didn't give that to him. He was upset. He got angry. He fought. Of course he's going to trash the room because it's a normal response. And then you have to wonder, if this was a white guy, would they have done the same? Because quite frankly, I don't think they would have. But because he was a black boy, they didn't see him as a kid. They saw him as a man and they held him down. And what was even shocking was that one of the nurses came to me and said, he's the same age as my little brother. And this is not fair. And I remember going into the room to give him some water and he looked at me side and was like, thank you, miss. Just for giving him some water to drink. And I remember going home and it deeply affected me. I couldn't listen to music. I couldn't do anything. I just went home and I was just like, this is racism. You couldn't tell me anything else, but this is racism. You have to give people a benefit of a doubt. And when they become aggressive, and then you've got a point. But that one thing, benefit of a doubt, was not given to him. And that deeply affected me. Because I know I've experienced it, but he's a child in care. And now, is he ever going to trust a healthcare professional again? Racism is definitely underreported because people don't know how they will be perceived. They'll be felt like they're trying to cause a problem or they're interrupting the natural order. You're often afraid that would this affect my career? Would this affect my development? Would this affect me getting good references? But it is definitely underreported. Um, People experience it day in, day out on the job. You tend to be just, you kind of sometimes push it aside and you carry on. Um, so when you look at the language of people in the 70s and 80s, the language was overt. But what you find is that it's become very insidious to the point where they make a point of not saying those words. So when you look at the racism report, when the government said there's no racism, there is clearly racism, but that report is violent because it's tried to undo decades of work that people have pushed forward. We know that racism is in the education system. You just have to look at what happened last year when you look at the automated GCSE results. People from poorer backgrounds who just happen to be poor black people, also with white people, were getting low grades. And now they can't get to medical school. Now they can't even do nursing. They can't do the careers that they want to do. But then when you look at the upper rich people, who often are white, they were getting through in life. Now, when we look at the incidents where an Asian doctor went to BBC, was it Channel 4 News, when he talked about he was a consultant surgeon and he's the one that does the operations. He's in charge of the care. All the junior doctors train under him. He saw a patient. He went through everything with and the person said, "Oh, I want another doctor." And he looked at them, didn't say anything. "I see what I can do." He left, and they sent the patient home to come in another day, which meant that they sent this patient home, and he would get a follow up with a consultant who probably is white, who does the same job as this Indian doctor. And he said to himself, like, how he wanted to react. He had to hold himself because he's got a kid, he's got a mortgage, he's got a family to feed. So you often then start to worry about the repercussions about your job. And, you lose this job, where are you going to work? How are you going to work? So for me, at the first peak of the pandemic, um, I wasn't at work. But what I can tell you for sure that is numerous friends called me and they were traumatized. They were absolutely destroyed by this pandemic. And what they noted was you'll find the people that were redeployed, a lot of people in the positions of band 5, 6 were mostly of BAME, black and Asian ethnic minority. And when you look at the senior management, they removed themselves far away from that. They were in hiring processes, at home shielding, doing other bits of work, but they were never on the floor clinically. We had people taking pictures that they were in bin bags and they were then caring for patients in adequate PPE. And at the start, when Anthony Johnson was writing his article for Nursing Notes, you were just seeing black people, Asian, black people. You would see a few white people, but all of them were carers. They were in lower paid jobs. They weren't in upper management jobs, and these people were dying. And I know I had a friend of mine who is of Asian descent. Her father died. She called me. She was in absolute tears. She fell apart, and she's an intensive care nurse, and what she saw and what she experienced made her want to leave nursing. I would love to go in details, but that would be her story to share. But what I do know is that made her want to walk away from nursing. Now, during the second wave, I was at work and you could see people from all walks of life just dying left, right, and centre. And this time it was scarier because they were younger. And yes, black people as well. And it scared me to the point that, you know, I go to work, the mask stays on. I barely even drank water because I was so afraid. But what you're seeing, the alarms were bleeping because oxygen pressure was falling in the hospital. And you get home, you wash, and you just stay at home. You do video calls with people. Racism, the COVID-19 really ripped open the inequalities that black people face, because the government will say, oh, you know, it's your blood pressure, it's what you eat, it's all of this, but actually there's so much more, so much more. And we know this because when you look at now, a young black girl, I think she was about 7, 9 years old, who had died because she'd had repeated asthmatic attacks. She lived very close to the main road, and the government then ruled that actually it was the pollution where she was living that caused the death. But how is she living in that area? When you look at it, say, oh, go and exercise, go and do this. Okay, where's those facilities in a poorer area? I wasn't sleeping much. Before I got very sick, I never slept. But now that I was on medication, just getting better, I still sleep. But the stress almost put you back onto, medication just to stop the anxiety attacks. Because I was afraid. I thought, there's nothing stopping them to redeploy me to the intensive care unit, and I will be at the very close of where these people who were dying. We had a doctor of Asian descent who died, picked COVID, and I remember just seeing him walk past me some 2 weeks ago, and to know that he was on the unit dying, and he died, I was terrified, absolutely scared, because I just knew that could be me. We had people, my colleagues, going sick with COVID, and it wasn't a standard flu. They were wiped out for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Some of them even took a month to 6 weeks to get better because they're close to my age. But, had they been 10, 20 years older, but then people younger than me were dying. Some of them, they can't walk down the street without being out of breath. That terrified me because the statutory sick pay, what is it? Just under £100 a week? No one can live on that. So you're afraid that, I don't want to get sick. So it's the mask stays on. I was dehydrated most of the time because I was afraid to even take the mask off half the time to even drink water. Because, you knew COVID was spreading. And I had colleagues picking up COVID left, right and centre from their kids. And then they were going into isolation. We were getting swabbed regularly. And I was always turned up negative, thank goodness. And when the vaccine came, I was beelining to the front to get it because I thought I'd rather get immune reaction than to get COVID itself. It's absolutely terrifying because I'm by myself. Yes, I have a family, a sister, but you don't have large amount of money to fall back on. You're not like someone who's rich as, the Beckhams where, you can afford not to work for a few days because actually, you can just withdraw into yourself. You don't have vast amounts of wealth. The most difficult thing during the pandemic that I experienced was within paediatric services, the complete cut of their services. So we lost a lot of our wards. So children had to be transferred out. what we found with some of the children were delayed presentation. So, late diagnosis of cancer, sepsis, some of them dying. And what we saw is a sharp rise of vulnerability in children. So, in mental health cases, I've never seen anything like it. And this is where you start to see some of the black children in police custody coming through the doors. Some of them have mental health issues, but when not under police care, it's just worse because the police force is another thing on top of what they have to experience in healthcare. So people said children don't get sick, but they do get sick. And, parents lost a lot of, emergency services, bed services, children having to be transferred across London just for the care. And what we found is, I don't know if you've seen, it's called PIMS TS, and it's basically children will get COVID, they'll get better, and then their body just goes into this dysregulation, inflammatory responses. And what we found was a lot of the children were black or of Asian descent. And then you look at the areas, so this was happening around Lambeth, around Edmonton, all these areas where you've got high populations of black people. And some of these children died. I went to a study day just to look at it, and this was related to COVID. So children do get sick from COVID. Their body tends to fight it off, and then it just goes into a whole. So what you're seeing is some of these children have like long COVID, just like adults get, and this is something that we were seeing, and it was quite terrifying. So I remember during the first peak, just as I was going back to work, because obviously what you found was a pattern after 3 weeks, children started to pick up all of this. And, doctors were, completely confused, scratching their head, like, what the hell's going on here? And a lot of these children had died. Some of them got better, but this was something that's very new. And this is when they started looking at data, across the world, like in Spain, New York, because they had clusters of it, and they started to see the same pattern. So for me, one of the hardest things is children's services has been cut back a lot, and you become almost, you kind of don't know how to work it, because now since lockdown lifted, those services haven't been fully restored. So these children are sitting in A&E longer, they're waiting for surgery longer, and this is the system that you have to work with, and it's absolutely stressful on you, and it's tiring. Some children are waiting for mental health beds for 3 days, 4 days. That shouldn't happen in a nation as rich as the UK. During the first wave, a lot of nurses reported this. So for me, luckily, I got away with it because my GP took one look at what was happening during March last year when I was supposed to go back to work, and he said, "Don't go back." He's going to a lot of care homes to announce deaths. So he said, "It's happening. What's happening in Italy is already happening here. The government's not reporting it." So he literally signed me off sick for another month. I was like, "Do not come to work because you will not be, you'll be at the mercy of what you're seeing." And even my union rep said, "Don't go in, please. Just get that extended." And people had no choice. You had to be redeployed. So my flatmate, she's of Asian descent. She had never worked intensive care. She'd done surgical outpatients. And she was asking all these questions about how to look after a patient on a ventilator, because I've done 1 year of intensive care. And I said, "I'm not an expert. I know the absolute basic to what I do need to know." And the children then get transferred out to the unit where they need to work. She was asking me all these questions. And she said to me, "They have no choice. If you refuse, that's you going to HR to get referred, and that's on your file. You cannot refuse." She said they will literally go in and they'll check in everyone's notes. So if you had a midwife who was a nurse by background who did extra training to become a midwife, she was going to the unit. Paediatric intensive care units across the UK, London, from what I know, closed their units, gave it to adults, and then these paediatric nurses, intensive care nurses, went in and looked after adult patients. And I think it's, a lot of them didn't mind because, these are people that needed help and care, and there wasn't enough nurses. The government was calling into private care to get help. But a lot of people felt at risk because when they didn't want to, especially if they had diabetes or asthma or sickle cell or something like that, they all felt afraid to go in. So a lot of the time they didn't go in, and they went to their GPs and pushed for. And sometimes they were finding problems in getting that certificate from their GP. And that was something that's quite shocking because you listen to, when I'm part of Nurses United, you get to hear stories of people that, try to get certificates and stay off work, and that was used against them, and they were forced to come back in. Um, and that's where you think that's clearly part of the systemic racism. Okay, why has the matron, the lead nurse, been allowed to stay at home because of the COVID pandemic, but why I'm being forced to go in, and I've got evidence that, I've got something that makes me completely vulnerable. Like they said, if you were elderly, if you had diabetes, or any of these things, you were at huge risk. And some of these people were still forced to go into work. And they were fighting their corner, sometimes getting unpaid leave, and then they were almost being referred to an MC. So you think, how can this not be anything but racism? Because what else is it expected? You know that if she gets COVID, I may be able to fight it off, but she won't be able to. The NMC, the Nurse and Midwifery Council, say they take concerns of racism seriously, and they said, we are trying our best and we are going to hire nurses from, all over. And I thought, that's not really how it works, because you're getting nurses who are maybe from the Philippines, India, from all over, and they are trained very expertly. If you just sit down and you listen to what they have to do for their training, but then these nurses then take band five, lower paid position, they're right at the bottom of band five, and they may be more skilled than someone like me. Even the matron, they're more skilled because the excellence and the skills that they're required to do their training, but yet they're at the bottom, and that does nothing enough. And what's interesting is the Nurse and the Midwifery Council then admitted that black practitioners are more likely to be referred by their employers, and a lot of them get thrown out. I think something like half gets thrown out. So that tells you that black people in healthcare are a target for their employers. So the members of the public are more likely to refer the white practitioners, but not the black. So that shows you, there's clear disparity going on here, and even how people get punished. Just last week when we heard about a white nurse who called black people spear chuckers, and she wanted to work with white people and not black people, she only got a 6 month suspension. But everything she said was clearly racism. But 6 month suspension, you often have to wonder, what about her patients? If she can say that about her colleagues, what is she saying about her patients? And then this is why I got involved with the Nurses of Colour, which is part of Nurses United, because me, Rachel, we've all experienced it, and we're all drawn together to the experiences that we've experienced. And we've left an open door policy, and people have come forward struggling, needing help, not knowing what to do. Sometimes some of these cases have been so horrific that I've said, you need to go to, Equality for Black Nurses. And they're a group of nurses who, like us, got together at the end, when we experienced George Floyd's death. They've got together and they do weekly calls, and they support people, sometimes far more expertly than we can, because what we want to do is bring a manifesto for change. Collect all this data of racism, because it's happening day in, day out. People came forward and they all talked about their experience. And I don't think this is something that the Nurse and Midwifery Council are challenging enough, or the union bodies. But we all know that this is happening. And this is why we think maybe if they say, where's the evidence? Because when you say something about racism, where's the evidence? We don't see it. We don't see your colour, So you think, okay, well, let's start to show this data, show this. And then you start to see, res data, they see this because, they've collated data of people's ethnicity and background and what jobs they're doing. And when you look at clinical and non-clinical, you're seeing the same picture. The further up you go, the numbers of black people drops dramatically. Absolutely. So within Nurses of Colour, as a group, we have met regularly through Zoom calls, and we've come across the same experiences happen again and again. Now, what we found is the res data looks at numbers and stats, but they don't often reveal the trauma of racism, that people experience within the walls of health and social care. So for us, we've got together and we managed to sort of develop this tool, We call it the racism reporting tool, which completely anonymous. When you look at this tool, you'll look at you could be a student nurse, student midwife, you could be any sort of background within working of healthcare, and you'll be able to report what you've seen or what you've experienced yourself. And what we want to do is collate all this information, place it on a heat map, and show the government that, this is still happening. You can't turn around and say that racism doesn't exist because that report says so. You can't turn around and say, we're working towards it because we're hiring people. That doesn't make any difference. What you need is people within all walks of life, all backgrounds, working within the health and social care, because their patients could be within that same patient group. They'll be able to speak the language. They'll be able to tell you actually maybe this family don't want a female doctor. It's not because it's maybe because their culture, and the only way you're going to be able to reach out and care as per nursing and midwifery standards is to understand this. So where I work, we've got a big sort of Turkish community. We have translators that work within that field, and they'll be able to tell you about the nicks within the culture and what they do, and that makes such a huge difference because now you can reach out to care and support them. But the only way you can do that is you've got people that work, who live, who grew up in that background, who'll be able to tell you. So when we got together, nurses of colour, we were just astonished. None of us knew each other. I mean, some of them knew each other through, protests and things, but our unique experiences, it's just happening again and again. And, you know, you have to often wonder, what about the people that are afraid to talk? So people come to us all the time, they'll tell us their experiences. And, we've been in touch with MPs, we've been in touch with journalists, just trying to get the message out, because some of these MPs have been interested because they know some of these MPs actually have a health and social care background, and they know too, and they see it on other walks of life, and actually they are passionate about trying to raise the alarm as well. The racism retorting tool will give the people the freedom to express, and it gives people the chance to tick and give their details to then come forward if they want to be able to say more. Now, within the NHS, they have the freedom to speak, to whistleblow, but whistleblowers aren't treated in any way fairly, safely. One has to look at the experience of the nurse who raised the alarm about poor staffing. I think this person had recently passed away, but suspended from job, lost their income. Can you imagine that? And then you look at the incident that happened just 3 months ago, where a white nurse realised that black colleagues were getting lower paid positions, were made to work harder, but all the white people not. And she raised this. This would have been called whistleblowing. She raised this, and she was told to be quiet. Eventually, she lost her job. She was not even able to work any shifts. This had to go to tribunal, and the tribunal then raised that actually the trust was being racist, and they ordered a payout. People see whistleblowers get treated in one way, and there's no way they're going to risk experiencing that because it's traumatic. Because when you get to tribunal, how many years is that? Fighting your corner, getting all these lies said about you. You can't work. How are you supposed to get by in life? Some people drop it and they lose their jobs completely. They have to then figure out another career, another walk of life. And this is something that's very scary. When you look at whistleblowing within sexual assault, we had a lady who whistleblowed against another nurse, and she was suspended by the NMC. She had to fight her corner, and she was very vocal about this on Twitter. Now, it may not be racism, but she was a whistleblower, and look how she was treated. So for us, in this racism reporting tool, we want people to be able to come forward, write down their experiences, and it's going to be anonymous. Now, if they wish to come forward and say more, they will, and we'll be able to show this heat map. So, this is not just in London, it's happening across the whole UK. The government need to acknowledge this and not tell us, oh, racism doesn't exist, because actually it does. People are experiencing it, and what you need to understand is how it's coming across, because it's not just these words, inflammatory words that get thrown out at people. It's a lot more than that, and it's so sinister. I think it's very important to fight so that people that this can be acknowledged, because if you don't fight, these things will just keep happening again and again. And this could be now your daughter, this could be your sister, it could be anyone that you're close to. Now, for me, when I listen to my sister's experiences of racism, it makes me so violated. She's my sister. I love her with all my heart. She's the reason why I keep going. I may not be close with my, brother or my parents, but my sister I'm absolutely close to. And that makes you feel like, can you imagine being a mother to a child who's maybe experiencing a sickle cell crisis, and the white nurse says, all you need is paracetamol. You don't need anything else. Do you know exactly how painful a sickle cell crisis is? But then what you find is that when it's a black person, the pain is desensitized, or they may be drug seeking, because that's always attached. And you always find that parents become very like hopeless and they are struggling. They try to look for somebody who may not be white. And when you find out there's a black person, suddenly they pull you in because they need your help. And then this is when you look at everything and then you like alert this to the most senior, consultant, like, we need to sort this out. And then things get sorted out. But they shouldn't get to that stage. And this is something that I've seen when I was in my student days, especially because this area had a big black population. So you had a lead consultant for sickle cell. So they looked after a lot of these patients. So sometimes you get a doctor who's never really maybe worked with these groups of black people, and then they'll just give this one medication. You think, you must be joking. We need to do more. Escalate it to the senior doctors, and then things get sorted. So my point is, we need to keep fighting because these are people in your everyday life. For me, I always feel very disappointed when we hear about a story just recently about a person suffering from sickle cell crisis calling the police from the bed just for help. And I thought, this is complete violation. This is absolute failure, and this is healthcare. Healthcare is a human right, and unfortunately, healthcare is littered with racism, and that's another thing that we need to keep challenging, bring it to light, highlight it. People need to confront the racial bias, and they need to. It's going to be uncomfortable. It's never comfortable, because the act of racism against us is absolutely violation. It's awful. There's nothing, as what you would say, is casual racism, because the act of it is absolutely violent, and it leaves the person feeling absolutely hopeless, sometimes angry. So people have different responses when it comes to racism. And for me, sometimes it's just taking a step back, looking at the situation. Because what I find in the past, I used to be very hot-headed and angry. Now I take a step back and just look, breathe in, breathe out. You've got to be analytical, because at the end of the day, if you get angry, you've proved their point. When you're not and you step back, they suddenly start to grasp, try to look for excuses. And this is when you're like, okay, now you've got excuses. Are you not willing to confront the biases? The hope I have for the future is to live in a fair healthcare system, um, where black people are not put in the back burner, are not gaslighted, their experiences are actually legitimised. Because we have, they've put policies and procedures there to say about race, equality and diversity. But I think that the words equality and diversity needs to go into the back burner, because look at society today. I'm proud of living in London. It's diverse and it's amazing. You can go to one part of London and experience the best Turkish food. You go to another part, the best Indian food. And this is what's great, because we are all human and we all have unique walks of life. But unfortunately, we're not treated as equal as the government likes to say that we are. Um, Corruption keeps happening, but racism is something that is so far complex. Um, the British are very good at gaslighting, and they're very good at saying that racism doesn't exist. But unfortunately, day in, day out on the shift, you see it. I'm hearing teenagers get arrested for reacting angrily to racism, and that ruins their life. You got a criminal record. Can you get into university to do certain courses? No. Can you get into certain careers? No. That's completely ruined their life, and they're not given a chance. Lives are being destroyed just because of racism. And unfortunately, this steeps into healthcare. healthcare professionals need to acknowledge that they have racial bias. They need to acknowledge that they benefit from it. You know, I've had a matron who was 2 years younger than me. And when you're at matron level, that means you are the manager's manager. You're looking at quality improvement, all of this. And she's younger. And I said, how can you not tell me that, you may be a fantastic nurse, but you've also benefited from a system that gets you very quickly to the top. Whereas me, I'm told there's no money. You've got to stay in your position and carry on working that position. So what I've learned is no matter how good you are, the system will work against you. And I dream that this is something that will be broken down completely. We've had a report for police force racism after the death of Stephen Lawrence, but we haven't had that same extent applied to the NHS, nor have we had it applied to education. And I would love to see that really exposed for what it is, because that's when we start to confront. Because quite frankly, it's just going to keep happening and people find ways to bury it, hide it, and the language changed. Because if you look at a generation of a black person from the 50s to the 70s to the 90s, you will always find a parallel of something that keeps happening again and again. And now we're in a situation where it's happening right before our eyes, but people deny it. So you have to often wonder what's going to happen in the future. How more sinister will it get? Black Lives Matter has always been important to me because we do matter. It's not to say that any lives don't matter. Black Lives Matter do, because history has told us it never mattered. To the point that Stephen Lawrence was killed and the police didn't feel like his life mattered to investigate. And to this day, not all the perpetrators were charged. But then when you look at the first chief commissioner, who was a black man, he released his book, Don't Kill the Black One First. Now, he was fostered and he talked about his experience being the only black man in the police force back in the 70s, I believe it was. And he clearly, saw racism day in, day out. Black Lives Matter, it didn't matter then. And this is something that keeps happening day in, day out. And it matters everywhere. But unfortunately, we're not seen as human. We're seen as, last resort, we're just not seen as human. We're not seen as valuable. Our lives are disposable. We're seeing this happen now in the Middle East with slavery. Historical slavery has ruined a lot of lives to this day. Rich people have got richer because of it. So for me, when that statue was pulled down of Edward Colston, that's exactly, I felt the joy in that, because actually he's had a whole, streets named after him, institutions named after him. And this is where you say black lives don't matter, because this guy made his wealth off slavery. He branded his human beings. Black people weren't seen as humans. And when you look at the American Constitution, all men are equal. But at that time, you had people being whipped, cotton picking. They weren't seen as humans. And it's like Malcolm X says, they weren't seen as humans. You had to pick yourself up by your bootstraps, as, Martin Luther King says. So for me, this same thing, this same violent approach of black people not humans is repeated day in, day out in our lives. When you challenge people, so like during the height of Black Lives Matter, when people are rioting, people said, oh, but they're damaging streets, and maybe they should be arrested and thrown in prison. And I said, but then how do you think black people got their freedom? Because it wasn't literally by a white man deciding that slavery was wrong. They had to. Then when you look at the racial apartheid of South Africa, people started to abolish, South African products and everything. And this is how they had to end apartheid. But when you look at the country now, today, when I went to Cape Town, it's still prevalent. And this is where it keeps happening again and again. And you're looking at what's happening with Palestine. Okay, they may not be black, but you do have maybe people out there who are going through exactly the same thing. And history is going to keep repeating itself again and again. And the Western world are on one side supporting the oppression of these people, killing them, providing arms. How can you tell me this is not history repeating itself again and again, like King Leopold did, Adolf Hitler did? Time and time again, black lives have never mattered in the eyes of white people. So for me, it is important that we keep sending this message out. I can't fight on all fronts, but I can, do the best I can from a healthcare perspective, from a nursing perspective. You've got people fighting their own corner in education, in history, like David Olusoga, and we need to keep going forward. People say it's not always about race, but unfortunately, in my life, the moment you're born, it's going to be about race. Because what about the care that your mother gets? She's at high risk of dying in healthcare. And then you go to education, you're more likely to be marked down, suspended. Then you go into whatever job you go to, you're not going to get the higher paid job. You're going to be put down. If you challenge, you're going to get dismissed. Trying to get care, like what happened to me, every walk of my life, it's a challenge. So black lives do matter because I do matter. And the people before me, a lot of people have died for freedom. And had they not fight for it, would I be here now? Who knows? Working in the NHS, the most overwhelming emotion I get is just exhaustion. I'm tired. How much more can I put up with this? How much more do I have to work with this? Is nursing even worth carrying on to work with? A lot of the times I say to people, if they wanted to do nursing, I say sometimes it's not worth it. Just walk away. Because not only is the pay poor, the working conditions is just awful. The redeployment, sometimes the abuse you're getting, just trying to navigate, and sometimes just from the attitude of certain senior management. You can't say no, you just have to get on with it, and you work. And it is hard for them, from your adult colleagues, because I'm in the children's side, but even now, sometimes to this point, I love nursing, but sometimes it's not worth the mental health. Sometimes I look at myself, 10 years ago, I was always outgoing, going on dates, and, having a laugh here and there. I'm not that person I was 10 years ago. Yes, I've matured and I've calmed down, but I feel like I've lost a lot of myself within nursing. And some things when I look at my pictures, just going back 15 years ago, and I think that girl's long gone. I'm more cynical. Um, and because racism is so rampant, I can see it more than I used to. Sometimes I think, oh, maybe if I don't pay attention to the racism, I'll be okay. But then you turn around and you look at the nurse who's only been qualified 1 or 2 years, who's starting to get some of the, maybe the racism abuse, and then you hear the stories that come through, and you think, no, I can't sit back. You've got to fight this because it's happening to them.